In the Pacific Northwest hides another world, one that can't be found in travel brochures or marked on marked trails. It's not just dense forests, endless rain and foggy coastlines, but forgotten trails where the footsteps of generations are imprinted on mossy stones. It is a land of silence, where the sound of droplets and ferns is louder than voices, and the scent of damp wood and pine is absorbed into the skin like a piece of memory. Hidden away from the bustling roads are waterfalls, springs, stone vaults, and places where every curve of the landscape seems to remember more than man can tell. What remains beyond the boundaries of the known, when the map ends and the road continues? The lost trail to the ice waterfalls in the Hoh River Valley goes deep into an ancient forest, where the trees are covered in layers of green moss and light shines through a dense canopy of foliage. The damp soil springs beneath your feet, and tiny streams trickle between the roots. The waterfall itself tumbles down a dark cliff, scattering in a spray that turns to ice chips in winter. The air here is cold and still, scented with spruce, stone, and melted water. An abandoned mossy bridge in the woods near Skycomish is barely recognizable among the tangle of ferns and fallen trees. It's built of rough beams covered in lichen, and its railing has long since rotted away. A crystal-clear stream flows beneath it, winding around smooth boulders as if frozen in bough. There is such silence here that you can hear every break of a branch under the paws of animals. A hot spring gorge in the Wallowa Mountains is hidden behind several kilometers of rocky trail winding down the slopes. The vapors rise straight from the cracks in the rocks, and the bottom is lined with smooth stones warmed by natural heat. The water exudes the smell of minerals and shimmers in shades of gray-blue. In the evening, mountain goats come here, and in the darkness you can hear the stone cracking from the temperature difference. A coastal path in the rainforest near Ozette leads between twisted roots that seem to rise from the ground. The trees are covered with green growths, and the branches lean overhead to form a green gallery. The sea breeze carries the smell of salt, seaweed, and distant storms. Sometimes the sharp silhouettes of rocks in the ocean can be seen through the foliage, like shadows that retain the shape of ancient creatures. This quiet black volcanic sand cove in southern Oregon is hidden behind serpentine cliffs covered with pine trees. The sand is warm, even on a cool day, and coral and lava fragments from the sea lie at the water's edge. The waves roll in slowly, and their rumble is absorbed by the wide dunes. Seabirds nest in the distance, and fox tracks in the sand disappear with each tide. An abandoned railroad among the cedars of the Columbia passes through tunnels and gaps where the sun's rays strike at a sharp angle. The rails are overgrown with moss, the ties touched with mold and almost fused to the ground. Giant ferns grow along the tracks, and when it rains, the road becomes a glistening corridor of water and leaves. Sometimes the echo of footsteps can be heard here, but no one can be seen. The relic bog in the Olympic forest is flooded with ancient water, covered with a dense layer of cassava and quietly pulsing with life. Dead trees stick out like dug-in spears among the peat islands. Birds fly low and the air smells of moisture, rot, and grass. There are no sounds of civilization here, only the splash of water and the rare cries of herons. Stone Arch Cove in the Samuel Boardman neighborhood opens suddenly around the corner of a cliff lined with pine trees. The arch, carved into the rock by the ocean, connects the two shores like a stone bridge. Inside the arch, you can hear the waves crashing, rolling back, which makes the whole shore seem alive. In some places, the rocks are covered with seashells, and at high tide, the water rolls over them like small bones. The mountaintop where the dwarf pine grows among the lava is like a strange garden at altitude. Gusty winds bend the pines to the ground, their roots clinging to cracks in the frozen magma flows. The soil is black, vitreous, and yellow and red lichens pierce through it. The air is clean, scalding fresh, and every sound echoes. The silent lake at Mount Mazama crater looks unreal. The water is too blue, as if absorbed into the sky. The lake stretches in all directions, and its shores are steep bluffs you can't walk on without a cable. In the center rises an island, almost perfectly round, overgrown with pine trees. The air here is still, as in a sealed vessel, and every rustle seems to disturb the peace. The grove of ancient Douglacious in Smith Valley stretches upwards in living columns over 1,000 years old. The trunks are covered with thick bark with deep furrows, and between them there is always semi-darkness, even at midday. On the ground are palm-sized cones and fallen branches covered in moss. The air is filled with the tangy scent of pine needles and earth, and somewhere high overhead, you can hear the rare cries of birds of prey. The coastal cliffs with sea caves at Brookings rise straight up from the ocean, breaking into the churning waves. On clear days, the entrances to the caves are visible, where light penetrates for moments, illuminating the seaweed-covered walls. The water inside the cave sounds special, muffled and strong, like the breathing of stone. Cormorants sit on rocky ledges, their silhouettes standing out sharply against the sky. The waterfall in the fog at the mouth of the Quinault River is hidden behind dense thickets of ferns and lianas, as if hidden on purpose. The fog hangs densely, and the water seems to flow straight out of the clouds. The jets fall into a round bowl surrounded by slippery boulders and water moss. The sound of falling water is muffled by the humid air, creating a sense of a closed, sheltered world. An abandoned lighthouse on an island north of Victoria stands on a bare rock blown by the wind off the strait. Its whitewashed walls are peeling and the lens is shattered, leaving only an empty ring of metal. Fragments of an old fence are scattered on the slope, and sparse bushes cling to the stone. Inside the lighthouse is a staircase going into the darkness, and a rumbling floor where the last keepers walked decades ago. The turquoise water canyon near the Clackatet River cuts through basalt cliffs, revealing smooth walls with ancient cracks. The water here is clear, with shades of malachite and ice, and even the rocks at the bottom are visible. Grassy ledges hide shallow paths leading to warm puddles where deer rest. Dragonflies hover over the water during the day, and in the evening the canyon quietens, reflecting the sunset in the smooth surface. The forest of coniferous giants above Croter Lake begins high on a ridge overlooking the blue bowl of water. The trees here are sparse, but each one is a giant with broad crowns and powerful roots embedded in the rock. Under their canopy lies fallen needles, soaked with resin and rain. Among the trees, you can find traces of old campfires and faded rags left by someone many years ago. The unnamed trail along the lava field at Mount Adams goes into the silence of a frozen magma flow. The rocks are porous and black, covered with gray lichens and ash dust. The hollows between the boulders are filled with water after rain, reflecting the sky, and it seems as if you are walking along the edge of an ancient lake. The air here is dry, and only sometimes the smell of ash and pine can be heard. Rare rhododendron bushes break through along the edges of the path, creating bright spots of color among the gray stones. In the evenings, there is an unusual silence, which is broken only by the faint crackling of the wind. In some places, you can see the remains of ancient lava bubbles, frozen forever in a fluid mass. Deeper into the lava field, one finds thin cracks, from which steam rises in the cold season. This landscape seems to be a frozen history, where every stone keeps the memory of explosions and fire flows. Quiet Beach with discarded boats at the mouth of the Rogue River is a strip of sand and pebbles where the river meets the ocean. Several wooden boats, abandoned long ago, stand on their sides, girdled with seaweed and covered in sand. Pieces of nets and shells lie on the shore, and crabs scurry among them. The water near the shore is murky but warm, and every tide brings new gifts. Here you can hear the cries of seagulls hovering over the water and periodically diving for fish. The coastal rocks are covered with green and brown sea moss on which snails glide. Winds off the ocean bring coolness and the smell of salt mixed with tree resin from the coastal forests. Sometimes the shadows of seals appear in the sea, watching the coastal tranquility. The stone towers hidden in the midst of the Siskiyou Ridge rise vertically like the fragments of giant columns. They rise above the pine-carpeted forest and disappear into the clouds. The wind walks between the towers, bringing the smell of stone, rain, and icy freshness. Below is silence, interrupted only by the crackling of cones underfoot. On their tops grow sparse alpine grasses and small shrubs, clinging to narrow cracks. The mist seems to live on, playing with shapes and shades, opening and hiding the towers. The stones are covered with mosses and lichens that glow pale green at dawn. At times it seems as if the towers are ancient guardians, protecting the peace of the slumbering forest. The wind brings the echo of distant mountain birds and the light rustling of leaves. The Cascade Mountains is a small gap in the woods by a winding river with a slow current. The water reflects the last shades of sunset, and the air is filled with evening coolness. The path leading to the water is trampled by hooves, and fresh tracks are visible on the damp ground. Everything here is frozen in anticipation, and at one point a deer appears, treading leisurely toward the water. There is silence all around, broken only by the splashing of water and the rustling of leaves. At dusk, the shades of green and brown blend to create an almost fairy tale-like landscape. The forest birds stop singing, giving way to the night sounds that fill the air. Mist slowly rises from the river, enveloping everything around with a soft shroud, emphasizing the seclusion of this corner. A gentle chill creeps into my lungs, reminding me that night is coming. The extinct fumarole crater atop Mount Jefferson looks like a gaping memory of the Earth's ancient fury. Its walls of gray tuff and charred basalt crumble in silence, beneath a wind that carries the smell of sulfur even centuries after the last eruption. Ice and debris have accumulated inside the crater, and melted snow forms a tiny lake the color of lead. The surrounding rocks are covered with an orange-yellow patina, traces of past mineral vapors. Rare sulfur crystals glistening in the sun can be found along the edges of the crater. In some places, the ground is still hot, and you can feel the subtle tingles of heat from the ground as you walk. The wind often changes direction here, making the sound of whistling fade in and out. At times, light vapor plumes can be seen in the clouds above the crater, remnants of deep activity. This landscape is a living reminder of the power and fickleness of nature. The grotto under the waterfall in Little Santam Canyon is hidden behind jets that fall from a height into a narrow stone cleft. You can only get inside in the summer by slippery rocks covered with water moss. Inside the grotto, the air is filled with a fine suspension, and every word echoes with a multi-voiced echo. Light shines through the water curtain, creating a ghostly glow on the damp walls. The laurel and cedar thicket on the shore of Lake Cushman stands almost untouched, with tall trees whose trunks are bent as if under the weight of time. The soft carpet of fallen needles muffles footsteps, and thick branches do not let in a single ray of the midday sun. Between the trees are thin streams filled with icy water flowing from the thawed mountain slopes. It smells of resin, wet earth, and something bitter that comes from deep within the forest. Thin rays of light shine through the dense foliage, playing on the dewdrops like tiny lights. The quiet buzzing of forest insects can be heard in the air from time to time, barely noticeable but constant. Dense thickets of ferns and moss create a sense of privacy and safety. Sometimes there is a slight crackle in the distance. Perhaps a pine cone falls or a dry branch crunches under the animal's foot. The lake nearby quietly shimmers in shades of green, reflecting the clots of fog that rise over the water in the morning. The clay staircase on the cliff above the Strait of Juan de Fuca is carved into the fragile rock and leads to a viewpoint where you can see the vast waters. The steps crumble underfoot, and each step requires caution. At the edges of the stairs, grassy grasses sway in the wind, and below you can hear the waves hitting the rocks. On clear days, you can see the silhouettes of distant islands and slowly sailing ships. Through the sea breeze, you can smell the odors of salt and seaweed. Sometimes seagulls come here, soaring and shouting over the waves like living arrows. In the evening, the horizon is colored in orange and pink tones, reflected in the calm water of the strait. Small shrubs and lichens grow on the cliff, clinging to cracks in the rock. From here, you can see the sun slowly sinking below the horizon line, painting the sky in bright colors. Silent fields of ferns on the site of an old farmhouse have grown around the foundation where a wooden house once stood. The stone rubble is now covered in moss, and young spruce trees poke through the cracks. Ferns grow above the waist here, forming a dense, rustling layer of green. In the silence, you can hear the wind rubbing against the leaves, and time seems to stand still, swallowed up in this sea of green. Along the edges of the fields are forgotten rusty tools and remnants of old hedges, barely visible under the grass. In some places, the soil is soft and moist, indicating the proximity of underground water. In the evenings, fireflies flit here, twinkling among the dense ferns like stars on the ground. The sun slips through the dense foliage, playing with patches of light and shadow. In this place, you can feel the breath of the past. The silence holds its secrets and stories unspoken. Bluff Gorge on the Oregon-Idaho border runs between steep walls of sparse brush and dry grass. Its bottom is strewn with boulders and wildlife tracks, and in the mornings, a thick fog gathers below. The stone walls echo every sound. Even a snap pebble is heard as a peal of thunder. Sunlight is reluctant to penetrate here, and the day seems shorter in the gorge than in the rest of the world. The edges of the gorge are lined with thorny bushes and sparse pine trees, whose roots cling to the thin soil, poking out of the cracks in the rocks. In winter, these rocks are covered with a thin layer of frost, turning the gorge into an ice palace, glistening in the sun. In the silence, you can sometimes hear the distant howl of a coyote or the rustle of an owl's wings hovering between the trees. Branches swaying in the wind create strange shadows that resemble the silhouettes of long-gone inhabitants of these places. In the evening, a deep darkness falls in the gorge, and even the moon seems dim and distant. The mossy trail to the vanishing Coleman Glacier leads through a thicket of ancient spruce trees, where each branch is covered with thick green moss. The ground beneath your feet is soft and damp, and beneath the layer of leaves are hidden roots that you must tread carefully. In the distance, you can hear the muffled rumble of ice cracking under its own weight. When the trail reaches the moraine, you can see the glacier, which has retreated dozens of meters in recent years. Rare mountain flowers grow on some of the rocks along the trail, white and delicate blue, a sign of life in the middle of the cold expanse. The wind brings coolness and pine odors, mixed with cold moisture from the mountains. The glacier, covered with cracks and deep crevasses, resembles an ancient ice river slowly dissolving under the sun. The echo of dripping water can be heard all around. The meltwater streams form small brooks poking through the moraine. On the slopes of the nearby hills, you can see traces of snow avalanches and debris that once rolled down. The volcanic amphitheater in the Mount Baker National Forest is a bowl-shaped basin surrounded by a ring of frozen lava flows. The rocks here are bizarrely shaped, like frozen waves in which motion is frozen. In summer, alpine flowers burst between the rocks, giving delicate accents to the harsh landscape. The air is thin and cold, and at night bright stars hang over the place without a single glimmer of light from below. Black rocks with dazzling lichen at the Deschutes River rise above the water like giant figures. The surface of the rocks is coal dark, but covered with patches of white-yellow lichen, which glows in the sun. Shrubs grow in the cracks, and along the edges there are trails where wild goats walk. In winter, the river is especially noisy, and steam rises along the rocks like smoke over a fire. The dry canyon with the remains of the Indian Trail on the Palace Plateau goes among sun-scorched hills, where the grass rustles faintly. On the stone steps of the ancient path, in some places you can distinguish the hammered stakes left from the old paths. Along the canyon walls there are petroglyphs, almost erased by time and wind. Sometimes there are animal bones and fragments of stone tools, evidence of a life that left this place long ago. The lake that disappears underground. Every spring, Oregon is located in the volcanic fields region of the Cascade Range. In early spring, it fills with meltwater, reflecting the sky and pine tops. But by May, the water suddenly disappears. It goes into the lava cracks cut in the bottom. The mirror-like surface is replaced by a dry riverbed with cracks and exposed rocks where lizards run around. The forest where only cedars grow and not a sound through them is hidden in one of the gorges of the Selkirks. The trees stretch upward with smooth trunks and no undergrowth, and the air is so thick that even birdsong seems muffled. Soft moss covers every rock, every root, drawing the space into a verdant silence. It seems that no sound can pass through these walls of needles and time. The misty valley at the foot of Mount Shasta fills with a dense vapor in the morning, hiding the grasses and shrubs as if in white absorbent cotton. Through the mist, you can see the outlines of snow-covered slopes, and from time to time, fallow deer emerge from the thickets. The soil here is black and warm, sprinkled with volcanic ash, and even in the silence, you can feel a strange, hidden energy. The locals consider this place sacred, marked by the breath of the mountain spirit. An underground lava cave with ice walls, lava beds goes deep into the depths, keeping the inside cold even in the height of summer. Moisture drips down the vaults, freezing into crystal drops, and the walls cast blue ice in the light of lanterns. The air inside is still and dry, with the smell of frozen lava and old stones. Occasionally, a muffled cracking sound can be heard. The ice is breaking under pressure, as if something ancient is stirring in the depths. A sheltered forest pond with circles of diving salmon lies in a sag between the hills, where no map leads. The water is dark with a tinge of green, and only the occasional splash of salmon breaks its smoothness. Fog swirls over the surface, and tree roots stick out from the edges, entangling the banks. On the rocks are the tracks of a bear that came in the night, left next to a deep sinkhole in the mud. Sand dunes with frozen coyote tracks are far from the shoreline. Among dry hills, reached only by off-roading, the tracks lead along a ridge, then abruptly disappear, as if the animal has vanished into thin air. On the sand, you can see the lines left by the wind and the thorns of tumbleweeds. The sun over the dunes is unbearably bright, but at dusk they turn purple and soft as canvas. Places where mountains are reflected in puddles on a forest road appear after heavy rain, when the ruts fill with water. The surface shows an inverted sky, silhouettes of spruce trees, and peaks that seem to float beneath the ground. These reflections disappear quickly when the wind blows. But as long as the puddle is still, it seems possible to pass through it to another place where the forest lives in reverse. Hot springs with white sediments among the pines look like the exhalation of the earth. Steam billows over them, even in winter. Mineral salts have colored the rocks cream and orange, creating whimsical shapes. Water gurgles from the depths, scalding with a pungent mineral odor. Pine trees stand around, their bark forever imprinted with the heat and steam of this place. The ruined church in rural northwest Idaho is a skeleton of boards and rusted metal standing in the middle of abandoned vegetable gardens. The roof has collapsed, but the stained glass windows still give a faint reflection if the sun falls on them. Inside, there are half-rotten pews and a moldy wooden altar. Pages of psalms are scattered across the floor, faded to near extinction. A plateau of lavender and bitter wormwood stretches across the highlands of central Oregon. The flowers sway in the breeze and the air is saturated with a tart, dry scent. The wormwood here is stiff with a silvery patina, and the lavender stretches low, clinging to the rocks. In the evening, roe deer come out here, their silhouettes moving through the lilac glow of the sunset. The place where two kinds of moss, wet and dry, meet is located in the shadow of an ancient ravine where the forests of coastal mists and drier inland slopes intersect. One moss is dark green, heavy, hanging by threads from branches like seaweed. The other is light, almost gray, prickly, growing in dense cushions on the rocks. There is a shaky boundary between them, where you can see the two worlds touching each other and disappearing into the gloom. The cliff where only fog and shimmering water can be seen rises above a narrow sea cove. At dawn from here, you can distinguish a faint shiver of light reflected in the coastal ripples. Everything else is hidden in a dense haze, where even the outlines of trees are lost. The wind at the edge of the cliff is cold and salty, and beneath my feet is smooth stone, with grooves as if carved by time. A wooden trail in the marshes of the Washington frontier runs into the horizon, among reeds and spruce trees blackened by moisture. Each plank groans underfoot, and beneath the decking you can hear a splashing sound, hidden life stirring in the depths. White patches of marsh flowers peek between the rusty reeds, and heavy water drips from the branches. Along the path, mushrooms with velvet caps grow, glowing dimly in the shadows. The path that only foxes walk on winds between boulders in an old forest, where animal tracks remain in the dew until midday. The branches above the path are low, festooned with lichen like garlands. On the roadsides are burrows in which red hairs and shiny bones are visible. It smells of pine needles, old earth, and an animal den left only for a while. A crater lake with a creaky boat on the shore lies deep among the frozen lava hills. The boat is tied to a snag, its wood faded and the rope frayed by time. The water in the lake is almost black, still reflecting only clouds and peaks at the edges. From time to time, the shadow of a bird passes over it, and the circles on the water disperse almost silently. The island, which can be accessed at low tide, is only open for a few hours a day. A path of seaweed and smooth stones leads through a foggy area where gull and crab tracks remain. On the island is an old hut, long abandoned, in a strange circle of rocks in the middle of a clearing. Only low grass grows around it, and you can hear the water coming back closer and closer. The natural stone circle in the pine forest is made of boulders, covered with light-colored moss and lichens. Trees around it grow strictly along the edge, as if protecting the silence of the center. Inside the circle, the ground is almost bare, and small purple flowers hide in it, blooming only in the cool of the morning. The stones tinkle underfoot, as if they held the echo of an ancient ritual. The depression in the rock where the crystal clear water is stored resembles a bowl carved by wind and rain. The water is always as cold as spring water, and even the smallest grains of sand at the bottom are visible in it. Only modest grasses and dwarf pines grow nearby, hiding from the wind. Drops of water from the edges of the cliff fall inside with a rare measured sound. The abandoned war tunnel in the Olympic Mountains is hidden behind a wall of ferns and slippery rocks. Its arch has partially collapsed, but the passage remains, leading into darkness that smells of rust and earth. Inscriptions are still visible on the walls, scratched out by soldiers or construction workers. It is eternally cold inside, and the echo of footsteps echoes like a deep well. The summit, with a view of the clouds covering the entire horizon, rises above a ridge where no trees grow anymore. There are only rocks, sparse moss, and an icy wind bending the grass to the ground. Clouds rise from below, enveloping the slopes like a sea poured over the edge. In the silence, only the crunch of gravel underfoot and the hum of air over the ridge can be heard. The place where beavers build dams in silence is nestled between dense thickets of alder and willow. Here, the water hardly moves at all. It is held back by branches, clay, and carefully stacked trunks. The banks are dotted with smooth cuts, teeth marks on young trees. The air is saturated with the smell of wet wood, and the sounds are only drips and occasional splashes in the twilight. The steps carved in stone, leading into the unknown, are covered with moss and barely visible in the shadows of the old gorge. Each step echoes as if the stairs were going inside the mountain itself. Ferns grow in the cracks, and at the edges are narrow traces of water flowing in the spring. It smells of stone dust and old dampness, as if the stairs had not been used for a long time. A giant boulder covered with gold rush inscriptions lies in the middle of a forest clearing surrounded by pine trees. The letters are carved with knives, charcoal, and even nails. Names, dates, arrows. Some signs are almost gone. Others are deeply cut into the surface, as if scratched out with desperation. The ground around it has been trampled by deer and foxes, but the boulder itself seems to be waiting for new stories. The river, in which only fire maples are reflected in October, flows slowly along a winding channel in the foothills. Leaves fall into the water, floating in silence, coloring the surface gold and scarlet. The reflections of the trees shiver in the light breeze, and it seems as if flames are flowing down the river. Fallen leaves rustle along the banks, and the air smells of smoke and cold bark. The abandoned observation tower at the top of the mountain stands on a rickety frame, grayed by rain and snow. The boards creak underfoot, and the stairs are covered in frost even on warm days. The windows overlook forests and valleys where only the wind moves. Inside there is an old map pressed against the stone and traces of a former silence. The valley without trails, where only eagles and wind are heard, hides behind a wall of cliffs and dense shrubbery. The space before the eye is an alternation of light-colored lawns, tall boulders, and sparse trees bent in the wind. Eagles soar high, their cries echoing like echoes of something ancient. The grasses sway smoothly, as if no beasts or men had been here for a long time. The shallow bay with rusty shipwrecks is covered with silt and seaweed, its surface fluctuating with the tides. The hulks are bent and half-rotten, like discarded skeletons from another era. Birds nest between them, and crabs and small fish live in the cracks. When the sun goes down, the water is copper-colored and the rust glistens like metal. The forest lake, which can only be seen from above, is hidden under a canopy of spruce and cedar. From the ground it appears to be just a gap in the thicket, but from an elevated position its contours resemble a leaf or a drop. The water is still, the color of steel, and only in the middle is the reflection of clouds rippling. The banks are overgrown with dense moss, and in the silence you can hear only the distant hooting of owls. The slope, covered with shale shards like mirrors, glistens under the rays of the setting sun. The stones are thin, sharp, layered like scales cracked by time. Every movement causes crunching and slipping, as if stepping on fragile glass. The colors change from gray to blue to copper, depending on the angle of light. The border between light and shadow at sunset, in the Cascades Mountains, moves quickly, gliding down the slopes like a breath. The treetops glow with copper light, while the lowlands are already plunged into blue twilight. The air changes dramatically, warm from above, moist and cold from below. It is as if everything around is holding its breath, waiting for the last glimmer of the passing day. The Pacific Northwest holds hundreds of places that can't be found on tourist maps. These are landscapes where nature speaks in whispers, and every turn of the trail is like encountering something ancient and forgotten. Here there is no noise of cities, only animal tracks, shadows of clouds and water wandering on moss and stone. All this remains invisible, unless you know where to look. To follow these hidden routes, where the roads end and the present begins, subscribe to the channel.